Today, I have with me Andrea Claassen on the show, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about Andrea. But first, I wanted to let you know that we go back quite a ways. We were in two different masterminds together with Jill Coleman. The original one, I believe, was 2016, 2017. And is that right, Andrea?
It was, yes, 2017, because my first son was born in 2016. That's how I know that.
Okay. It's been a ways back. And then we came together again in a second mastermind with Jill Coleman and Shante Cofield, and we met up at a event in LA in what is it called? Manhattan Beach. And we reconnected then. And I was on her podcast just a few months ago, and now she is going to be telling us all about how Ayurvedic medicine can apply to perimenopause and menopause. So I am so excited for this, but let me tell you a little bit about Andrea. Andrea Claassen is an Ayurvedic wellness counselor, Ayurvedic postpartum doula, hopefully I'm pronouncing that right, RYT 500-hour yoga teacher, and Wild Woman Circle leader. I want to find out about the Wild Woman Circles, who has been in the wellness space since 2007. Her mission is to help you start to live a cyclical life by living in alignment with the seasons using Ayurveda as your guide. She does this by teaching her peaceful, power practices, love that name, centered around movement, mindfulness, and Mother Nature through an Ayurvedic lens. You can hear more from Andrea on her Peaceful Power podcast, where she aims to deliver actionable takeaways for you to live a more holistic lifestyle. Andrea is a mom and recently gave birth to her second child, a son. Congratulations. And she is the author of Divine Body Wisdom. She also has a new book that will be releasing, I believe, in September, entitled The Ayurvedic Approach to Healing Your Menstrual Cycle. And that will also have some wisdom surrounding perimenopause. Andrea, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here, Carol.
I'm excited to have you here. I have so many things I want to ask you. So when I was looking, it was funny. I was looking through your website and I saw your beginnings where you were 16 years old. You started weight training. You had a coach that taught you to weight train. So then you began personal training, and you were only 16 years old. And you've even trained some Olympic athletes, which I was like, wow. But then your trajectory of both your career and your life took a sharp turn when you went to Costa Rica, the jungles of Costa Rica, for this yoga retreat, and you discover Ayurveda. And can you talk about this a little bit and what happened and why?
Yeah. So I went on a whim to this yoga retreat in Costa Rica. I've only been to this person's class once before. It was a random, like, hey, we're on vacation. I popped into this gal's studio. And it really was just like a kismet meeting because, I mean, I've stayed in close contact with her since, but she really introduced me to like the true yoga. And when we were out in this Costa Rica retreat, she just mentioned, well, Andrea, you're a pitta. And I'm like, what do you mean pitta? What does this mean? And so she said in Ayurveda, there's doshas and you are a pitta. And so there's practices that you can do to kind of help find your balance. And the friend that was with me, she said, you're a vata. And so, Zoe got her prescription. And so we kind of both came back like, oh, this is interesting. And I really was intrigued. And so I signed up for a yoga teacher training, like sight unseen. I had no idea. The first one I Googled when I got home, I'm like, sign up for this. Because I assumed, okay, I'm going to learn about Ayurveda. I went to the training and, it was a year-long training. But within the year-long training, it was only about 3 hours of Ayurveda. And so I was like, well, I want more. I want to know more just about Ayurveda. And so I signed up for my first Ayurvedic teaching program right after I gave birth to my son 7 years ago, and really deep dove there. And that really transformed my whole postpartum experience after giving birth, because I was finding the traditional Western way of healing wasn't necessarily helping me. I ended up with a glute tear, coming back into exercise. And I've been pre-postpartum certified for 16 years. Like that was my first thing I got certified with. So I've worked many, many years. And that was the Olympic athlete that I worked with during pregnancy postpartum. So I know what I'm doing. So that's where I was like very frustrated with the whole process. And, I needed to obviously stop moving. And then, as you had said for my bio, that's really like who I am. I like to move. Like that's how I kind of really find the sense of self, and it is my like endorphins and my happy release. And so without that, I found myself really struggling, and on top of having a new baby. So that's kind of where Ayurveda really came into my life. And I think that's probably some of the reason that I really grasped to it, because it did kind of, I guess, save me in a sense of finding myself all over again.
It's fun to look back and think about our story because we all have a story. I really noticed that in the mastermind, because the mastermind, for the listeners, it's for coaches in the fitness world, and all of our focuses are different. We're all doing something a little bit different within fitness, working with different populations, primarily women. But we all have a story, something that brought us to that point where we went, this is what I need. This is the thing. And then that leads to, of course, helping other people. You go out in the world and you're excited to share that. For the listeners, because I didn't know this either until I actually had a personal training client that was certified in Ayurvedic medicine, and that was my introduction to it. And so she told me something about it. But for the listeners, what exactly is Ayurveda?
Yeah. So Ayurveda is it is the wisdom or science of life, and it originated in India over 5,000 years ago. And basically, how it translates today, it's a lot of wellness and lifestyle practices, and those are kind of the things that I give, I guess, tips along. I can also kind of read pulses and look at people's tongues and diagnose that way as well. But often, what we're doing is it's a lot of lifestyle practices. It's a lot about, okay, I work a lot with the hormones. I'm having XYZ, bloating, PMS. I'm struggling with transitioning into perimenopause. How can I set myself up so I'm not having these symptoms? And so we're kind of getting to the root cause versus maybe putting a band-aid on things, or, hey, take this pill. So we really are trying to like dig underneath. Well, why is this happening? Why are you getting the PMS? Why are you having the bloating symptoms? What are you angry? Are you, what's happening around this time? All of those things, to me, I kind of play off like, oh, that sounds like XYZ dosha in my head. And so that's kind of what I'm doing as people are talking, pinpointing it to a dosha that might need some assistance. And then based on what I'm seeing, I can prescribe like, okay, here's kind of your plan based on here are the different doshas and elements that might be a little bit out of balance.
That's so interesting. So, what is a dosha? Because I was
Yeah.
listening to your podcast, I was trying to grasp it, and I'm not sure that I fully understood the concept.
Yeah. So doshas are your mind, body. I'll start with this part of it because it is a vast undertaking if we think about all of the things the doshas are, because it is. It's associated with many things in Ayurveda. But the way that I use it directly with people, it's your mind body type. And so we all are born, we call it your prakriti. That's the innate dosha that you're born. So you can't change that. It's at birth. It's actually at conception. This is what you were conceived. This is your dosha elements. Then you have your vikriti, which is the dosha imbalance. So that's the thing that might be giving you the bloating, giving you the PMS. And so when I'm looking at that, I'm thinking, okay, like for me, I'm a pitta. Like that's just what I was born. And I could talk about what those mean in a second, but that's my dosha. Now, the first year postpartum, I'm actually juggling a little bit more vata, because that tends to be the dosha that comes out of sync during that time of life. And that's the same as like menopause. They have certain doshas that are going out of balance at menopause that aren't necessarily related to, everyone in general, but most people are going to be having their eyes on their pitta dosha a little bit more at that phase, and their kapha, versus the vata. So there's little elements like that you're kind of looking at, or that I am looking at as a practitioner. And the doshas are also associated, this is where it probably can get confusing, with a season. So in the summer, it's actually the pitta season. And so if we think about pitta, fiery element, it's hot. It's hot in the summer. And then we have the fall, it's windy, it's air, which is the vata dosha. And that's associated with the wind and air elements. And then early winter is still that vata season. And then that winter, late winter to spring is kapha. It's the heavier, the denser energy. If we think about that heavy snow, I know you don't live in a place that has a lot of snow, but in Minnesota, we have really heavy snow at that late winter stage where you're really shoveling it. And we always call it like the heart attack snow. It's one where people have to be careful because it is so dense and heavy and wet. And then come that springtime, it's more that dense, heavy mud, wet, that rainy. Those are all kapha elements. And so it's also associated with the seasons. They also are associated with the time of life. And so not only do you have these doshas in the seasons, in your body, but also stage of life. Kids are actually from 0 to about 18 in the kapha stage of life, which might seem a little counterintuitive because that's your heavier, your denser energy, but it's also the building energy. And so what are kids doing? They're growing. So they're building. That's a lot of the building energy that they're going through. And then out of balance, that kapha can be mucusy. And then, of course, what do kids have? A lot of mucus. You go to any daycare, get lots of runny noses. And so that's kind of that kapha. And then that middle stage of life, kind of the stages where we're working and we're working hard and we're go, go, go. That's the pitta. That's the fiery and energy, just as it was summer. So you have a lot of that heat, a lot of that buildup because we need it. You have to go to work. You have to be productive. You have to be doing. Or if you're raising kids, all of that is productive building energy. And then once you're at like retirement age, or usually 55 to 60 is back into the vata stage of life. And so that vata stage of life, things can get a little air, is again that air element. So people can get a little bit of forgetfulness. If you fall, more likely to break a hip, break bones, all of that is associated with that vata energy. And so that's where having a good understanding about where you're at in that stage of life, knowing, I might have to combat a little bit more of pitta or vata or kapha energy. So I'm not going out of balance. And that's kind of how I look at all of that. So I'm looking at, not just your mind, body, but seasonally, where are you at? And then, where are you at in your stage of life? So that's why I said it can be a little confusing because it does encompass so much, but it is so important.
It is. I mean, really, functional medicine works that way too, because I'm very interested in functional medicine, and they are very concerned with the root cause as opposed to just medicating and pill for an ill, they say. But they're also concerned, and especially within females' life, the different cycles and stages of life, because it makes such a difference where they're at. I mean, what are they doing? Are they working? Are they raising kids? Are they taking care of elderly parents? Now I'm in my 60s, completely different energy to this stage of my life. I find myself wanting to pause more, not because I'm
Mm,
tired, but because I don't want to rush things. Whereas when I was younger, it was like rush, 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 rush. Get the kids out the door. Let's go to dance lessons,
yes.
PTA,
Yes.
whatever it was. And now I'm like, no, give me some time to take this in. And so it's just interesting to hear you talk about the seasons, the actual weather seasons, which fall is I love fall, my favorite season of the year, and then the seasons of life. So question, how does someone discover their dosha, the
So
one
you
they're
can take
born
a
with?
So you can take a dosha quiz. I have one on my website. It's like right on my homepage if you scroll down. Now, with those, I always caveat if you answer, you have to answer totality within your life, not just because what often happens or what I see happen sometimes is people are like, I'm a little confused. I thought I was this after learning about them, but then my quiz gave me this. And so often, people will answer to what's going on directly right now in your life. That means you might get your vikriti or your imbalance and not your prakriti. So if you think about, okay, maybe right now you could be going through a health issue and you're answering towards that versus like, oh, in general, I've actually been pretty healthy and I've actually aligned more with these ways of my health. Now, I will say I care more actually about working kind of with that imbalance typically is when people come to me is because they don't feel like themselves. Something's off. And so I'm trying to figure out, okay, how can we tame that dosha down to get you back to your balance? And we have all three of these within our bodies is in varying amounts. And so for, we could both be pittas, but you might be, a little bit higher in your kapha and I might be higher in my vata as a secondary. And so we might need different things even though we're both pittas. And so that's where Ayurveda is really an individualized, kind of system because we're trying to figure out what exactly, are your needs versus my needs versus someone else's needs.
Do you find, because this just came to me as you were talking, this is an ancient practice, and now we bring it into this crazy world we live in with all of the ultra processed foods, the stress. So we ignite cortisol just sitting in traffic or, having a near miss or whatever. We get a text that's nasty from somebody, and it's like, it's such a different world. How do you bring this ancient practice to this modern world?
It's one of my favorite questions, and one that I kind of I actually had a gal who was also an Ayurvedic practitioner, and we were chatting about this in the podcast in particular because a lot of the teachers that we learned from weren't moms. And it is a different ball game when you have kids and you're trying to live Ayurvedically because, as you said, there's just a lot of stuff going on, and you're not going to be able to be perfectly living this Ayurvedic life. It's just not. It's not possible, in our fast paced world. But what are the tools and tips that you can implement? And so, with like the mindfulness, in the morning, like I have a little meditation cushion. I usually do it in my office here, but since my son was born, I made another little location upstairs because it's easy where I can get him down for a nap and then I can just sit on my pillow. And I might not do a 20-minute practice because I don't have time, but I can sit for 5 minutes and do my meditation. And so it's little ways like how can you kind of tweak this into your day where the full Ayurvedic routine in the morning is like 2 hours if it took someone, to get through it. Most of us aren't going to get up at 4:30 and, do our abhyanga and then hop in the shower and then do our tongue scraping and our oil pulling, all of the things. And then, somehow kids are going to stay asleep the whole time and, you don't have places to go and they don't have places to go. And it's just not going to be possible. So I always tell people is like, what are the things that are beneficial for you? What are the things that make you feel good? And implement those and start there rather than thinking I have to live this perfect Ayurvedic lifestyle. Because I found that for myself and for people that I work with, just a few of these things can go a long ways.
Yeah, it's consistency, right? It's just doing what you can day to day and in the moment, which is it's like that with all lifestyle habits. We do the best we can with our exercise routine, our nutrition, but there's going to be times that it's off or we travel or when you have kids, they're going to interrupt your sleep. It's just going to
Yes.
happen. You're not going to get your full night of sleep. So you got to do these workarounds. But I think it's just really about being largely consistent over time. We don't have to check off every single box every single day.
100%. I mean, that's at the end of the day, like Ayurveda recommends after every meal, and in particular after your evening meal, go outside and, walk 100 steps. And so some people are like, great, that might be the only movement they get that day. But then they find 100 steps might lead, hey, I can do this for an hour. I have an hour where this feels really good. And that might be their practice. Especially if they have a really stressful life, hey, that might actually be the great time to just de-stress before bed so you can sleep better. And that translates into other areas of your life. And so that's where Ayurveda can really we call them keystone habits from one of my teachers. Like, how can you combine a couple habits together? And so if you're struggling to sleep, maybe it is that, okay, I'm going to take my 100 steps after dinner, and then it might turn into that 30-minute walk, and then, okay, that's my cool down, my decompression time before I wind down. And maybe you're not on your phone or working. So I have a lot of people who like to work long hours and they'll trickle into 10 o'clock at night and they're still working. How can we have that boundaries that we set with ourselves so we have a little bit of space for us and for our health practices?
Oh, boundaries, so important. And we forget about the ones we have to set with, we think about boundaries like I got to set this with this person and that person. It's really what's within us. It's setting the boundaries within ourselves, saying, okay, putting away the laptop, putting away the electronics. It's time to relax and unwind before bed. So I love that you touched on that. Now I want to talk about perimenopause because it's a roller coaster and it's like reverse puberty. I've heard people describe it as reverse puberty. And at first I thought that's an odd way to describe it, but that's really what's happening. And it was funny, raising kids and it's like they're starting to go into puberty as I'm, kind of reversing, but their hormones are ramping up and mine are ramping down. I'm like, this is not a good combination. Whoever thought of this. so,
Oh,
so what
oh,
do you
that's funny.
What do you see in perimenopausal women, and what is your approach if one comes to you, they're out of balance? What is your approach working with them?
Yeah, so this is an interesting topic in Ayurveda. So perimenopause is a new term in Ayurveda. It was not around 5,000 years ago. It wasn't a thing. And so some of the teachers are now speaking to it because people are talking about perimenopause. And so they're saying, well, if you are, and this might be too late for some people who are like, oh, I'm already there. But if you're not quite into perimenopause, this is why I'm really passionate about helping people fix menstrual cycle and even perimenopause. Because if you start to get those if you're not having the PMS, the bloating, all of the rage, whatever happens to you around that time of the menstrual cycle, if you can get those symptoms, really smooth and seamless, typically that's a great indicator in Ayurveda how you're going to experience menopause. And you're not even going to notice you're in perimenopause. You're just going to kind of seamlessly transition right into menopause. That is the Ayurvedic approach to menopause. And so that's why I try to tell people the earlier you can kind of start getting a grasp on some of these things, the better. And again, that could be in perimenopause where you're like, okay, let me fix these things now. So hopefully that will save me from having some of, hot flashes and night sweats and all the things that we think about, with menopause that are the not fun symptoms. So with that being said, I have people all across the board and that I work with. Some take the pills, and we also say, hey, the next generation can help. You can help heal them. And so I have a mom who's like, I can't. I thought I was going to be the generation that heals. I'm not. I got to take the therapy, the hormone replacement. She's like, I'm doing all the things that I didn't want to do, but that's just where she's at. Her kids haven't slept, and just as you were saying, her kids are actually younger. She had them in her 40s, and so she's at this age where they're not sleeping the best still, and so she's like, they're going to have to be the generation to heal. So that's also a way that Ayurveda kind of looks at these things too. So I'm like, how can I best support you, knowing that that's your choices too? And she still wants to do some of these Ayurvedic practices, but she can. And so that's kind of where I play like, okay, what is your situation? And I've seen lots of different ones. But in general, perimenopause, you follow the same things as you would during your menstrual cycle. Those are kind of the same tips that I use for people. And so really backing it up into the doshas. We look at the vata, pitta, kapha. We all have that dosha. We also have, I call it kind of your menstrual cycle dosha. And it should ideally line up to your actual dosha. So as I said, like I'm a pitta, my menstrual cycle, it does, it lines up. I usually have pitta symptoms if I have any. Now, knock on wood, every time you have a baby, it's kind of a nice little reset to things. I get my period back super early, so I got it 2 months postpartum, and I have not had any symptoms. And this is now my third month of getting my period back, and I've had no symptoms. Like it's been easy breezy, and I'm like, wow, like this is why I'm like, this is why I love Ayurveda. I did all the practices that they suggest to do, and I did them during pregnancy, postpartum, and I've really seamed out all of these symptoms that I've had. And I used to get cramps, and I used to really feel some intense cramping right before I would bleed, and I was working on easing those up, and then now they have really, knock on wood, I'm like, okay, this is great. Now it doesn't mean that they won't come back. That's why I say knock on wood, because I have to keep those practices. I have to keep doing the practices I'm doing right now because they're the ones that are working for me. They're the ones that are, keeping those things away. I thought it was raspberry leaf and oat straw infusions. I didn't have any this last month. And I'm like, okay, so these are truly, I'm making time for meditation. I am working out. I'm doing Abhyanga daily, which is a self massage. I'm doing those are basically my big rocks that I'm doing. And those are enough to help keep them away right now. And so that's kind of what I'm looking at when I'm thinking about perimenopause for anyone. What dosha symptoms do I see? How can we kind of treat it based on that?
So a lot of self-care. What I'm hearing is you've got some solid self-care practices. You're taking time for yourself,
Yes.
filling up your cup. They always say that, fill up your cup so you can help others. And I actually had someone on the podcast yesterday. We were talking about self-care in
Oh,
perimenopause and just how important it is because of all the stressors coming at you from different directions. So, it's just good to hear that addressing that makes such a difference. Now, how do you feel about PMS? Because I know in the functional medicine community, and I've heard several doctors say this, they're like, PMS is not normal. having heavy cramps is not normal. And I remember hearing that because I was raised hearing, oh, this is just part of being a woman. This is almost like your cross to bear, so to speak.
Yeah. Yeah. Ayurveda says the same thing. We really look at that. I've actually encouraged people who, to seek out a second opinion for blood clots. So blood clots for us, if you have a lot of them, she was like, oh, I'm having quarter-sized clots. And I'm like, oh, ask your doctor. That in Ayurveda, that's too large. And then her doctor's like, oh, it's fine. And she, in her heart, was like, it doesn't feel like it's fine. I feel like this is a lot of blood every month that I'm losing. And so we did some of the practices. And so in Ayurveda, that's a kapha imbalance. Plus, she had some other kapha symptoms. And so that I looked at, I'm like, okay, we're going to follow a kapha, lifestyle reducing practices. And then it was able to ease out that next month. This clots went lower. And then usually it takes about 3 months. That's why because once your follicle is released, like it takes about 3 months to mature out. So that's why I tell people, just the first month might not be what you're seeing from your practices. So sometimes people, just as in fitness, you're like, I want that instant result. It takes about 3 months before you start seeing things. The same thing with fixing menstrual cycle things. It's not an initial like, oh, this is it. It takes a little time. But with this, I would love to just kind of tap a little bit in case people are like, how do I know what symptoms I have? Vata, Pitta, or Kapha. So if you're kind of thinking, these go for menstrual, perimenopause, or menopause. So these are all kind of under that same umbrella. So if anyone's listening, they're like, how do I know what do I have? So Vata, what we're looking at if you have a Vata imbalance in general, dry skin, anything dryness. So that's all Vata. Scanty bleeding during perimenopause. So you might slowly, maybe you actually had a pretty consistent bleed during your regular cycle years, and all of a sudden you're noticing it's getting really light or it's barely there. That would be a Vata thing. Digestive discomfort, constipation, those are all Vata. So that one I often hear, especially the days leading up to the bleed, you might feel constipated. That's all Vata. Trouble sleeping, trouble focusing, anxiety, and then bone loss. So those are all Vata symptoms for all menstrual cycle, perimenopause, and menopausal years. Pitta, they tend to have the hot flashes. They're cranky. They're irritable. They have the heavy bleeding in perimenopause. So maybe it was regular, but then all of a sudden the bleeding starts to really increase. Excess heat in the body. So they might have like they have hot flashes. They had maybe some heart imbalances. So maybe some more heart flutter issues, anger, jealousy, and then inflammation or red skin tends to be pitta kind of imbalances that I see. And then kapha tends to be the weight gain, sadness, depression, just feeling of heaviness in general, and then just lack of focus, but due to feeling dull. So they might be the ones who get stuck on the couch. They don't feel like doing anything. Not the lack of focus because they have so many things like popping around. It's more like just, I feel dull. I feel like I've lost my sparkle. That would be kind of that kapha. And so that way, if people kind of know like, oh, okay, how do I know which one I have? And then in Ayurveda, you treat by doing the opposite. So if you're thinking, okay, I have a lot of that dryness or that vata, Abhinyanga, that's my go-to, and especially in menopause and perimenopause, really starting Abhinyanga practice of that self-massage daily. And we recommend sesame oil. You like the cooking sesame oil. Personally, I think it smells not great. So I do a lavender blend. And so I make my
Mm.
own, like I do an avocado oil and then do some lavender because it smells better. And you can also buy some. Banyan Botanicals has a ton of different options as well, dosha specific. And you just heat it up. So you'd heat it up for a minute or so, and then you just warm it and you rub it down your skin. So you start at like if you're on your feet, you start at your feet, you rub up towards your heart. So long strokes up the body. Around your joints, you do circular strokes around like your knees and your elbows, circular pattern. And then you do your arms up towards the heart, down towards the heart. And then, if you want to have a partner to the back or you just leave the back. And all of that, I do put a towel underneath me because it will stain potentially your couch or wherever you're doing it at. And then in Ayurveda, they suggest taking a shower after. But I have found I love to do it in the evening. And that's the time where I'm like, my boys are asleep. I just sit down and that's my time to kind of do this. I don't need to shower after, but I have oil that's not going to stain my sheets. If you do use like the cooking oils, you probably want to shower that off because it's going to stink and it might stain your sheets. So finding that oil that's, again, the Banyan Botanicals ones usually are pretty good for not staining things as well. So that would be a great practice if you're experiencing dryness or in general, perimenopause, menopausal clients. That's one of the practices I recommend to do daily. And it doesn't take that long. It can be 5 minutes, it can be 20 minutes, make it how long, you want to make it.
I'm imagining that it's stimulating the lymphatic system.
Yes, that's exactly what the goal is. And so you're moving the lymph. That's why I said you're going up towards the heart. I have varicose vein on my legs, and I find it really does help with circulation as well. So if you're kind of nicely going up, this is not like a firm massage that you're getting, from a masseuse. It's just a nice self-love. Abhyanga actually is a self-love, it translates to. And so it's practice that really you're supposed to just kind of, okay, even if you're like at the time, maybe you're not loving what your body looks like, but still, how can I put in love into this? And how can I really, kind of get to that space, even if it's just, maybe it's just you start with your feet, wherever you need to start with.
This is so interesting. And I just thought this is such a random question, but as you were speaking, it popped into my head. Now, I'm assuming you work only with women.
I
I'm
do have some men.
wondering, that's what I was wondering. I
Yeah,
was
I do.
wondering
Yeah.
what do you see in the men? I mean, obviously it's going to be totally different. What do you
Yeah.
see in the men?
Yeah, so I do have some men at the studio that I do some independent contract work with, and typically it's stress. And a lot of the times it's men who are, I think, 55 to about 70 are the age range that I see at the studio who are seeking out Ayurveda. And a lot of it is just stress. Their jobs, very stressful. They're at a point in their life where they're like, I don't feel good. I'm not, I'm tired of taking, blood pressure, heart medicine, all of this medicine that they're on. They're like, I need to fix something. And so they'll come to start doing yoga as a stress reliever. And then they might have heard about Ayurveda. And so then I'm looking at what practices can we do. A lot of times we do some diet stuff. Sometimes they just are grabbing, your quick on the go meals. Coffee and living off coffee. So we're kind of fixing some of that stuff as well. So similar to women, because we're kind of guilty of the same thing, grab and go, granola bar some days and out the door, have your coffee. And then that's obviously not great for hormones. And so it's kind of the same boat there.
And I think men internalize stress. I'm thinking of my husband. I'm more likely to just start talking about everything and just spilling it out. And
Yep.
he's just gets real quiet.
The men too, and they're in the sessions, typically it's the men are very slow to warm up, and usually about like, we're approaching time, all of a sudden that's when you're like, boom, those last 5 minutes, they tell you all of these things where you're like, I would have loved to have known that like 30 minutes ago, And so that's what I find too, is they still, even in consults where I'm going through and asking lots of questions, and then all of a sudden those last 5 minutes, then they're like, here's the actual things. And you're like, okay, shoot. Well, might need to see you for another session because we got some other things that we got to work on now.
I want to shift gears a little bit because I was thinking earlier when you were talking about the heavy bleeding, because that was definitely me, very, very, very heavy. And I had fibroids. I had estrogen dominance. Do you see a lot of estrogen, especially I think in those early perimenopausal years?
Yeah, so estrogen dominance and then progesterone, sometimes low progesterone, on the flip side, does not always mean those are tied hand in hand. I actually found I was the opposite. So I do try to preach people, just because you do have high estrogen doesn't mean your progesterone is low. Sometimes that can be just fine. Because I actually had my hormones tested before I had, my second son here. And that was shocking to see, because I went and got my hormones. So I had been doing all of my Ayurvedic practices, and I just was like, something is off. I'm pretty sure I have high estrogen. I want to just have my test done, just to verify everything. And then sure enough, she came back and said that. And then it was like also shocking, because most people's progesterone is low. And in Ayurveda, that's a really easy fix, which makes sense. I'll tell you in a second what those tips are. But she's like, yours is just fine. But nature is actually one of the best ways for progesterone to increase. And I'm out in nature all the time. I love nature, and giving hugs and laughter. I mean, there are simple things in Ayurveda. Those are ways that you increase progesterone. We don't have to go on to take supplements. Now, excess estrogen, we're kind of looking at the liver. And one of my favorite ways to do it is castor oil packs. And so castor oil packs are ones that if anyone has excess estrogen, or are in those perimenopause, and even menopause, if you would like to do them, castor oil packs all day long. Not really, don't do them all day long, but do them like, depending on what you're working with. If we can do them weekly, you can do them a couple times a week. I just tell people just not to do them on the week that they're bleeding. Now, for you, for example, if you had a heavy bleed, I would say you're going to avoid yours. So if anyone's listening, they're like, oh, I have a heavy bleed. You don't want to do it probably the first 3 to 5 days leading up to your cycle. So day one is that first day you bleed. So if let's just say, for example, someone has a 28-day cycle, I probably wouldn't go to day 25. I wouldn't go past that and do a castor oil. So days 26, 27, 28, skip it. Because what I found happens is their bleeding is even heavier. So do the castor oil pack a little bit earlier, and then regulate the cycle a little bit more, and then eventually the castor oil pack will have no effect on the increase or not of your bleeding. But the first few times, if you're just going to do it, I found people are like, whoa, it's a lot. Other ways that we can do with kind of thinking about the liver. So Ayurveda really enjoys looking at supplements as a final thing. And so sometimes people are like, oh, do I have to take all these supplements? Ashwagandha is one that is very common in Ayurveda. And then Shatavari is actually one that I like to work with females more. And so ashwagandha is kind of more the one that us practitioners give to maybe males. And then Shatavari is actually one that we give a lot to females. And so I personally like this in a milk tonic. And this is a great one, again, for perimenopause and menopausal years. And what you do is you just have about 1/4 a teaspoon, you warm up some milk, throw your shatavari in there, and then just putting in some spices. So depending on what dosha I'm seeing, some people, if you need some warming spices, might have your cinnamon, your cardamoms. If you need ginger, if you wanted some cooling spices, you might have some mint variety of some spot, or you might actually just put in some mint leaves. And those are different ways that you can kind of help with bringing down things. And so if I do an herb, that typically is one that I'm going to use to help balance estrogen and progesterone.
Very interesting. Yeah, the herbs and then also the castor oil packs, because I've heard those are actually very, very good for detoxification. They're good for digestive issues. That's where I've heard them used, and it's interesting that you use
Those are
them
my
in.
absolute favorite. I mean, I use them for all of those issues. Like I've used them for digestive issues. So if anyone feels that constipation, so if you have a more vata cycle, I use this a lot with people who have that scantier flow that I had talked about. Go ahead and do this leading up to your cycle, because this sometimes will help get the flow going. So if you're not getting things moving and it does feel like it's really slow, castor oil packs can kind of help stimulate things. I've had clients use them on injuries. So I had someone ask, can I do this on my knee to help reduce inflammation? And I said, yeah, try it. And she did. She was like, I can actually start to run again, because she was doing it every night, doing castor oil packs on her knees. So I'm a big fan of using them for reducing inflammation. And then just elevating your feet slightly on something. So laying down on your back. Usually you do them for about an hour if you have time. And then either meditating, watching something. If you're going to watch TV, watch something that's not like a crime, Dateline type of thing. You want something calming and
Guilty of that.
relaxing. I do. I love me some Murder, She Wrote. So that's where I'm just telling you, a calming TV.
Oh,
Regular Hallmark channel instead of Murder, She Wrote. And I'm also a Hallmark Channel fan, so that's why I say my Hallmark movies here. But that would be something to do to kind of help reduce that stress, because often, stress is also going to put effects on that liver, and just the environment that you're in. Like air purifiers can help too. I just recently got a couple air doctors for our home to reduce some of just all of the stuff that's coming with the new baby. And I already was like, okay, these do work, because I've had to vacuum. They say to vacuum every month, just do the filter, and you can see what it's collected. And my husband was like, I don't know if these things work. And then once he saw what it collected over a month, like, okay, who knew that there's just all of these things floating around? And you, as you said, you had dogs. I have a dog and a cat, and all of the fur that comes off and the dander, and, they do work, because otherwise our bodies are filtering, through all of that stuff.
Yeah, we're exposed to so many toxins now too, and our bodies are really good at detoxifying. It's not that our bodies can't, but the two issues I see is it's the load. It's more
Yep.
than we were intended as human beings to handle. And then people are different. That's really what I've been discovering. Those detox pathways are even genetically different. You know, you might have somebody that is exposed to a chemical and they have a horrible reaction, and someone else where their body is able to handle that load.
Yeah, I mean, with the air, we've had a lot of air quality issues this summer here in Minnesota from the Canadian wildfires. And
Yeah.
so even that, you're inside more. And my air doctor is, somewhat near the door, and it would go off if we left the sliding glass door open, for a couple minutes. It would go off. It turns red when it's, serious stuff it's trying to filter
Yeah.
through. And so you just know, like, wow, our bodies are filtering through this. Even just quick walk to the car, or, if you're not outside for too long. So those are all little things that, again 5,000 years ago in Ayurveda, we didn't have to process all that, and that's why they recommend doing that, as well as strengthening the Agni or your digestive fires in general, which could be a cleanse, which is often recommended. I have found in menopausal women, it's better than menstruating women, seasonal cleanses during the fall and the spring season, and that can look like a basmati. Now, this is all stuff where you might think, wow, this is a cleanse, and it's more of a basmati rice, but it's really soupy. So it's not like you want to cook it, so it's kind of like you're drinking the basmati rice, and you put some ghee and some kitchery and some spices. It's called kitchery. And so that is one that I've had clients do, and they actually do look forward to it. They actually do it on their own now, because I've taught them how to do it, just for 3 to 5 days, and they'll do that seasonally, and it's just a good, just kind of reset for the body. So like if you think about summer, if you maybe had alcoholic beverages or food that you didn't normally eat, as you transition into that fall season, it's a nice time to kind of reset the body. And so those are why Ayurveda recommends it at that time. And then again, coming from the winter season into the spring, those two seasonal shifts are some of the hardest for our bodies to kind of go through, as their big dosha swings, because coming from that pitta into that vata season, I see a lot. Typically, September is the month where you have an influx of people, just because that vata energy is going, and maybe you've burnt out your pitta energy, because again, we think fire, it's all burned out. You feel overwhelmed. School starts, got kiddos and things. Work maybe is now ramping up. And then now all of a sudden our vata's out of balance, and we're thinking about all the things that need to be done. Plus, we're feeling already burnt out from the summer. And that's when we start to feel not so great. And so that's why Ayurveda recommends just taking a few days to reset. And I always tell people, reset with social media, reset with technology. Don't watch TV. Be on your screens as little as possible. Just take a week to really reset everything. Because again, they didn't have that when when the cleanses were recommended in Ayurveda originally, but now we do. And so we're seeing we have to, again, we digest in Ayurveda everything. So not only what we eat, but what we're seeing. And so if we're constantly on screens, if we're constantly looking at stuff on your phone, scrolling, just as you had said, you might have a friend who texts you something horrible. Then you get on social media and you're like, oh my gosh, my favorite celebrity just passed away, and all of this. And now we're digesting it all, and it's just coming at us so fast. And typically you might have just done that in your 10-minute work break. And now what do you have to go back to work? You don't have time to process any of this. And so then it just kind of gets stuck and stagnant in the body. And so that's what Ayurveda, I think, does a really good job of just recommending. Like, we're digesting everything that's happening to us in our days. We need to take time and hit reset, whether that be a set time during the year, or, hey, every month I'm taking a week to do XYZ.
I could not agree with you more. I find it so harmful. It's not that there isn't a good side to social media. I mean, obviously, we have online businesses, we're on it, I'm on it, but it can just weigh you down after a while. The comparison, I mean, it's just
Oh,
so natural, especially for women, to just start comparing, whether it's, oh, her business is doing a little bit better than mine, or she's a little bit thinner than me, or she, look at her, and and it's not even a jealousy thing. I think it's just this self comparison that is so harmful mentally. And I do believe I've kind of pulled back my son is visiting. He's on leave from the Navy. So this month of July, I mean, I'm posting, I'm present, but I really pull back. I'm not scrolling like I was.
Yeah. I mean, and that's me being postpartum too. If you see other people who have kids around you and you're like, man, I do not bounce back right away. I don't look like that person. And again, it's no shade on them. It's just like you start getting in your own head about things. And I have found that to be, true as well. And that's why I try to share it. Like I usually never have filters on, because that's another one where I actually had a friend who met someone, a different business coach that I had years ago. And we randomly saw them in person. And the friend was like, that's not the same person you were showing me, like on her Instagram. She didn't even think she looked the same. Like she was like, I would have never in a million years guessed that that was her. And I was like, I never want that ever to happen to me, where like people couldn't like where you're just like, you're you. Like I would have never thought you looked like that, because you're always so filtered up and you have the perfect everything. And in real life, you're like, you don't have a filter, obviously, when you see people. And so that was kind of a rude awakening. I mean, I didn't really use them then, but that was my awakening to being like, I never want that ever to happen, where people are like, I don't recognize you. I would never have guessed that's you in real life.
I agree with you. I am mortified by the fact that someone would not recognize me. I feel good when somebody comes up at the gym and it's like, oh, I follow you on Instagram or Facebook, blah, 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 blah. And my name is, and I'm like, oh, good. They recognize me.
Yes.
I don't look different. So I don't use the filters. I will post a professional photo sometime, but I've even pulled way back on those because I want to look like me. And whether it's to see the wrinkles or whatever, I want to look like me. I don't want to look polished to the point that someone would not recognize me or I look 30 years younger. That just is not for me. But I do get sad seeing very young girls just put filter after filter and not show up without those filters. It saddens me,
That,
most
yeah.
definitely.
A lot of friends who have kids, that's one of their concerns. And I have some friends who just said no social media to their middle school, high school daughters. And one of my clients actually had said no to her middle schoolers. Now that they're in high school, she was like, I think you're old enough to. And they both looked at her and they're like, no, mom, I don't want it. After seeing what social media does to my friends, I don't want to be part of that, because they saw them, they would get to school and they would be fighting with other friends and they didn't know why. And they're like, I don't want to know why. I don't want to be part of this world. And so that's also something that, anyone I think with kids think, like middle school or even young kids, you're like, at some point you're gonna have to have this discussion. And how do you teach people that sometimes the presentation there isn't real? Because sometimes you don't know as a kid. I mean, looking at us at magazines back in the day, I thought that's exactly
Oh,
what people
yeah.
looked like. You didn't know that they
Same.
were filtered. I was assumed, I'm like, how do they get their bodies like that? I don't, my abs aren't quite tweaking just quite that way. And,
All
we didn't
airbrushed and
know.
perfect. Yeah, we
Right.
didn't
So,
know at all. Yeah, I grew up with a 17 and then I'd get my hands on I would Cosmo was forbidden, but I would get my hands on it anyway. So I know exactly what you're talking about. That was
yes.
totally my era.
Yes.
Well, and Andrea, I want to be respectful of your time. I know you're a busy mom. You've got a lot going on, but as we wrap up, can you tell the listeners how they can get a hold of you, work with you, and then how can they get your books?
So you can just find me on my website, which is my name, which is AndreaClaassen.com. Peaceful Power Podcast is a great podcast to tune into to kind of learn more about Ayurveda. And I would go back to maybe, I've had my podcast for 7 years. So go back quite a few episodes now. I presume, like, I'm presuming my audience is like really intermediate to advanced now with Ayurveda. So if you're like, I don't understand anything, I would go back like 100 episodes to kind of really sift through some of the earlier stuff. Or even look on my blog, because that's a great place to kind of really dive deeper with Ayurveda and any topic. And then my books are right on my website. So if you just kind of go to my homepage and scroll down, I don't have them on Amazon. I might someday. And my book coach had just recommended not to when I first did it, just because she's like, people are probably going to find it from you, not from the Amazon search yet. I was like, oh, so that's what I kind of did. And I haven't taken the time now with the little one to figure out how to put them on Amazon. So someday, my first book, Divine Body Wisdom, which is all practices, they're seasonal practices. And that is recommended you can match it up to your menstrual cycle phases. Or I have many people who are in menopause. I wrote this in purpose because I have clients who are in that age, but they wanted this book. And so I'm like, I'll keep it seasonal as well. So then they can just flip through and say, what are some practices I can do in the summer? And they can just do any of the summer practices. And those would be great little, starters for Ayurveda. And then the Ayurvedic approach to the menstrual cycle is got more practical, like here's how to, as I talked about the Vata, Pitta, Kapha, there's chapters on each of those. And then as well as perimenopause. And then introducing young girls to their first menses. What are some ways you can celebrate that? I have that in there as well.
Oh, I love that. What you just said, I love because I think as women, this is just a side note, but there's so much shame around having our menstrual cycle for the first time. And then, going through menopause, I remember feeling a little bit embarrassed or ashamed,
Mm,
like I needed to hide it. And I'm like, why do we feel this way? So I love that you celebrate it. That's so cool.
yes. Yes. And I
So
think
cool.
sometimes too, as parents, like they're like, I didn't know what to do. Like my mom was like, my mom didn't really do anything for me. And so this is where for maybe you don't really, or never even dawned on you to celebrate it. Like here's some realistic practices I put in there. I put some like, hey, if they want a ceremony or other little practices that you can do. Cause not every, young girl is going to want a ceremony with, her friends and her mom's friends, but maybe there's other ways that you can celebrate a little bit on a smaller scale.
But how beautiful. And I have so many grandmas that listen to the
Yes.
show and
Yeah.
and new grandmas,
Perfect.
so this is good for them to hear. What a beautiful thing. Andrea, well, thank you so much. I appreciate you coming on and I've really enjoyed our chat today.
Thank you, Carol.
And to our listeners, wherever you are in the world, we wish you every blessing. Bye for now.